I've spent 20 years looking for the son of the man who refused to let me repay him." The words floated across the quiet Montana morning long before Ethan Carter fully understood what they meant. He stood on the weathered front porch of the small farmhouse he had inherited from his father, still holding a battered coffee mug in one hand while the other rested against the old wooden railing that had survived countless winters. The gravel driveway stretched toward the county road, where a gleaming black Rolls-Royce had just come to a stop in a cloud of pale dust. Nothing that expensive had ever entered this part of Ashford. The neighbors would be talking about it for weeks. Ethan watched as the rear door slowly opened. A woman stepped out with calm confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy business suit beneath a camel overcoat that looked more expensive than his pickup truck. Her blonde hair moved gently in the cool breeze, and although every detail about her suggested extraordinary wealth, it was the expression on her face that caught his attention. She did not look proud. She looked relieved, as though she had finally reached the end of a journey that had lasted much longer than the miles behind her. In both hands, she carefully carried a small cedar box, worn by time, yet protected with remarkable care. She climbed the porch steps without hesitation until she stood only a few feet away from Ethan. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the wind brushing through the tall pine trees surrounding the property. Finally, the woman looked directly into his eyes. "Are you Ethan Carter?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She drew a slow breath before answering. "My name is Victoria Hayes." The name meant nothing to him. She noticed the confusion on his face and offered a gentle smile. "I own Hayes Global." Ethan blinked in surprise. Even someone who spent most of his days repairing old engines had heard that name on the evening news. Hayes Global built hospitals, funded universities, and appeared on lists of America's largest companies every year. He looked from the elegant woman to the luxury car parked beside his cracked driveway and wondered if someone had made a terrible mistake. "I think you have the wrong address," he said politely. "I am just a mechanic." Victoria slowly shook her head. "No, Mr. Carter. I have searched for this address for almost 20 years. Before Ethan could respond, the old screen door creaked open behind him. 8-year-old Emma stepped onto the porch wearing faded blue jeans and a yellow sweater, holding a half-finished drawing in one hand. She looked curiously at the unfamiliar visitor before walking beside her father. Victoria's expression softened immediately as she smiled warmly at the little girl. "You must be Emma." Ethan frowned gently. "How do you know my daughter?" Victoria looked down at the cedar box before lifting her eyes again. "Because I have known about your family for much longer than you know." Emma quietly slipped her hand into her father's. Ethan felt her small fingers tighten as uncertainty settled across the porch. "What is this about?" he asked. Victoria carefully placed the cedar box on the weathered porch bench without taking her eyes off Ethan. "Your father changed my life on a rainy afternoon 20 years ago. I came today because I promised him that if I ever found success, I would come back to repay what he did for me." Ethan lowered his gaze toward the old cedar box. His father had been gone for 5 years, yet somehow the past had just arrived at his front door wearing a tailored suit and carrying a mystery that neither money nor time had managed to erase. For several long seconds, Ethan Carter simply stared at the cedar box resting on the old porch bench as though it belonged to another lifetime instead of his own. His father had repaired engines, raised a family with rough hands and quiet faith, and lived every day as if kindness required no audience. Never once had he mentioned knowing the woman standing before him. Ethan slowly looked back at Victoria Hayes, searching her face for any sign that this might be some elaborate misunderstanding. But everything about her expression spoke of sincerity rather than performance. Emma gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, is she telling the truth?" Ethan answered honestly without taking his eyes off Victoria. "Sweetheart, I do not know." Victoria nodded with understanding. "You have every reason to question me." She carefully remained where she stood, making no move toward the cedar box. "Your father taught me something very important. He believed trust should never be demanded. It should be earned." Those words landed heavily in Ethan's heart because they sounded exactly like something his father would have said. He remembered countless evenings sitting at the kitchen table while Samuel Carter quietly explained that respect always arrived before answers. Victoria noticed the flicker of recognition in Ethan's eyes and smiled gently. "I can see you remember him." Ethan lowered his voice. "I remember almost everything. That is why I cannot understand why I never heard your name." Victoria looked toward the distant mountains before speaking. "Because your father never helped people so they would remember him." The wind carried the scent of fresh pine across the property as silence settled once again between them. Finally, Ethan motioned toward two old wooden chairs on the porch. "Please sit down." Victoria thanked him quietly before taking a seat, placing the cedar box carefully beside her feet. Emma disappeared inside the house and returned moments later carrying 3 glasses of iced tea on an old serving tray. Victoria accepted hers with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Emma." The little girl smiled shyly before sitting beside her father. Ethan folded his hands together. "Start from the beginning." Victoria nodded slowly. 20 years ago, I was not a chief executive. I was 26 years old, frightened, exhausted, and almost completely broke. My car broke down on a lonely stretch of highway outside this town during a cold rainstorm. Ethan listened without interrupting. I had almost no money left. I had been turned away more than once because I could not afford repairs. Then someone told me there was an honest mechanic outside Ashford who might still be working. Ethan already knew what name was coming. My father. Victoria smiled softly. "Yes." Her voice became quieter. "I found his garage just before sunset. I expected another repair estimate that I could never pay. Instead, before he even looked at the engine, he asked me one question." Ethan unconsciously leaned forward. Victoria looked directly at him. He asked, "Have you eaten today?" Emma blinked in surprise. "That was the first thing Grandpa asked." Victoria nodded. "Not whether I could pay. Not what kind of car I drove. Not who I was. Only whether I had eaten." Ethan slowly smiled despite himself. That sounded exactly like him. Victoria continued. He walked into a small break room, returned with half of his own sandwich, poured me a cup of hot coffee, and told me that people make better decisions after a meal than on an empty stomach. She paused, allowing the memory to settle between them. That simple kindness changed something inside me before he ever touched my car. But what happened after he repaired the engine is the reason I have spent 20 years trying to find this family. Because your father refused something that almost nobody else in the world would have turned down. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment, as though the memory had never truly belonged to the past. The gentle breeze stirred the leaves surrounding the farmhouse, while Ethan and Emma waited in complete silence. Finally, she looked back at them with a quiet smile that carried equal parts gratitude and disbelief. "After your father finished repairing my car, I asked him how much I owed." Ethan rested his elbows on his knees, listening carefully. He handed me the invoice. It was much lower than I expected. I thought he had forgotten to include the labor, so I offered him $5,000 instead. Emma's eyes grew wide. $5,000? Victoria nodded. At that time, it was almost everything I had left after selling my grandmother's house. I believed generous people deserved generous rewards. She paused before adding softly, "Your father looked at the check for only a second before handing it back." Ethan smiled faintly. "He refused it." "Immediately," Victoria answered. "He said, I charged you exactly what the repair was worth. If I take more because you're emotional today, then tomorrow I will have forgotten who I am." Ethan slowly closed his eyes. The words felt painfully familiar. Samuel Carter had often said that character was measured by the decisions nobody applauded. Victoria continued, her voice steady but warm. "I insisted. I thought perhaps he needed the money, but was too proud to accept it. His garage was old. His equipment had clearly been repaired more than replaced. I even told him that nobody would ever know." Ethan quietly laughed through his emotion. That only guaranteed he would refuse. Victoria smiled. "You know him well." She glanced toward the old garage standing beside the farmhouse, almost unchanged after all these years. He wiped his hands on a faded shop towel, leaned against the workbench, and said something I've carried with me every single day since. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. If kindness ever becomes something people can buy, then it stops being kindness and starts becoming business. Silence settled over the porch once again. Emma looked from Victoria to her father. Grandpa really said that? Ethan nodded without hesitation. That sounds exactly like Grandpa. Victoria carefully wrapped both hands around the untouched glass of iced tea. I left that garage believing I would never see him again, but before I got into my car, he called me back. Ethan leaned forward. What did he want? Victoria's smile became softer. He asked me one final question. She could still hear Samuel's calm voice as clearly as the day he spoke. If life ever becomes kinder to you than it has been today, promise me you will look for someone who cannot repay you. Help them without expecting anything in return. That will settle any debt between us. Emma whispered. That is all he wanted? Yes, Victoria replied. No contract, no address, no promise to come back with money. Only that one promise. Ethan stared across the familiar fields stretching beyond the porch. Suddenly memories he had not visited in years returned with surprising clarity. He remembered watching his father quietly leave groceries on a neighbor's porch after a difficult winter. He remembered anonymous Christmas gifts appearing for families who had lost everything in fire. He remembered evenings when his father came home later than usual because someone's truck had broken down and they could not afford repairs. Samuel Carter had never explained those acts. He had simply lived them. Victoria watched the realization slowly settle across Ethan's face. I kept that promise, she said gently. As my business grew, I quietly helped people whenever I could. Every scholarship, every family I supported, every opportunity one created began with one rainy afternoon inside your father's garage. But there was one promise I could never fulfill because before I could find him again, I learned he was gone. That is why I spent 20 years searching for the only people who could still help me finish where your father started. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the Montana sky, covering the farmhouse in warm golden light as if the day itself had slowed to listen. Ethan sat quietly, unable to pull his thoughts away from the stories he had just heard. For years he had believed he knew every important chapter of his father's life. Yet now it seemed Samuel Carter had carried an entire world of quiet kindness that even his own family had never seen. Victoria gently reached into her leather satchel and removed an old photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. She carefully handed it to Ethan. The edges had faded with time, but the image remained unmistakable. A younger Samuel stood outside his little garage wearing grease-stained coveralls, smiling beside an old pickup truck with one hand resting on the hood. Standing next to him was a nervous young woman in worn blue jeans, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands. Ethan immediately recognized his father's smile. It was the same gentle expression that had greeted neighbors, customers, and strangers alike. Emma leaned closer. That is Grandpa, Victoria Nadif. Someone passing by offered to take the picture. I almost threw it away years later because it looked so ordinary. Then I realized it captured the most important day of my life. Ethan carefully turned the photograph over. On the back, written in his father's familiar handwriting, were only 6 simple words. Everybody deserves another chance to begin. Ethan quietly repeated the sentence under his breath. He had seen those same careful letters written on birthday cards, grocery lists, and old notes left on the kitchen counter. His father had never used complicated speeches. He believed the simplest truths lasted the longest. Victoria watched the memories returning to Ethan one by one. After my company became successful, I hired investigators several times to locate him. Every search ended the same way. They could find records of his garage, tax filings, and property ownership, but almost nothing else. It was as though he had spent his entire life avoiding recognition. Ethan smiled softly. He did. He looked toward the old garage, standing beyond the porch. People tried to nominate him for community awards more than once. He always declined. Victoria looked surprised. What? Ethan chuckled quietly. He used to say that if someone needed a plaque to remember being kind, they probably missed the point. Emma giggled, imagining her grandfather saying those words. Victoria laughed gently as well before her expression became thoughtful again. Last month, one of your father's former customers finally remembered hearing that his son still lived here. That is how I found you. Ethan slowly nodded. Then you drove all the way from New York just to keep a promise? Not just a promise, Victoria answered. A responsibility. She looked toward the cedar box resting beside her chair. Your father trusted me with something before I left his garage that day. Ethan's eyes settled on the weathered box again. He had wondered about it since she stepped onto the porch. It was small enough to carry with both hands, its cedar surface darkened by decades of careful preservation, its brass latch untouched by rust despite its age. What is inside? He finally asked. Victoria rested her fingertips lightly on the lid, but did not open it. I have never looked. Ethan frowned in surprise. You carried it for 20 years without opening it. Yes, she replied, because he asked me not to. Emma looked between them with growing curiosity. Did Grandpa say when it should be opened? Victoria slowly nodded. He looked at me before I drove away and said, if you ever find my family, place this box in my son's hands. Only open it when he is sitting beside you, because whatever is inside belongs to both the past and the future. Ethan felt a quiet chill despite the warm afternoon. He carefully reached toward the cedar box, his fingers stopping just above the smooth, worn lid, realizing that after all these years, the next chapter of his father's life had been waiting patiently for him to come home. For a long moment, no one reached for the cedar box. It rested quietly on the weathered porch bench, holding its secrets with the same patience that Samuel Carter had carried throughout his life. Ethan slowly sat beside it, running his fingertips across the smooth wood. Tiny scratches covered the surface, each one a silent reminder that it had traveled through decades without ever being forgotten. Emma leaned closer, her curiosity shining brighter with every passing second. Daddy, she whispered, do you think Grandpa knew this day would happen? Ethan smiled gently without taking his eyes off the box. Your grandfather believed people always found each other when the time was right. Victoria quietly nodded. That was exactly what he told me before I drove away. The afternoon air remained calm as birds sang somewhere beyond the open pasture. Everything around them seemed ordinary, yet Ethan could feel that nothing about this day would ever be ordinary again. He carefully lifted the cedar box onto his lap. It felt heavier than its size suggested. The brass latch showed no sign of being forced or repaired. Victoria watched silently. I checked it every year, she admitted. I made sure it stayed dry and protected, but I never broke my promise. Ethan looked at her with quiet respect. Most people would have opened it. She smiled softly. Your father trusted me. I cannot betray that trust. Ethan rested one hand on the lid. Then we opened it together. Victoria nodded once. Emma moved closer until she was sitting between them. Ethan slowly released the old brass latch. It clicked with a soft metallic sound that echoed across the peaceful porch. As he gently lifted the lid, the faint scent of aged cedar drifted into the cool afternoon air. Inside there was no fortune, no jewelry, and no hidden stack of cash. Instead, several carefully arranged items rested exactly as Samuel had left them. On top lay a worn brown leather card holder with softened edges from years of use. Beneath it sat a small spiral notebook wrapped neatly in a clean white cloth. Beside the notebook rested a sealed envelope with one sentence written across the front in Samuel's familiar handwriting. It simply read, "For my son, when the time is right." Ethan stared at the words without speaking. He recognized every curve of the handwriting immediately. His throat tightened as memories of childhood notes, tucked into lunchboxes, and birthday cards returned all at once. Emma reached for his hand. That is Grandpa's writing. Ethan quietly nodded. Yes, sweetheart, it is. Victoria gently pointed toward the leather card holder. He placed that inside before handing me the box. Ethan carefully picked it up. It was old but well cared for, carrying the scent of leather that had aged with dignity. Inside were several faded business cards from local suppliers, an old photograph of Ethan as a little boy sitting on his father's shoulders at the county fair, and one folded $20 bill that had clearly remained untouched for years. Emma smiled at the picture. You were little. Ethan laughed softly through the emotion. Very little. Victoria watched the father and daughter studying the photograph before quietly saying, "Your father once told me that people should always keep one reminder of what mattered most." Perhaps this was his. Ethan carefully returned everything exactly where he had found it before lifting the small spiral notebook. Its cover was plain, with grease stains near the edges and a single handwritten title across the front. There were only 3 words. Acts worth remembering. Ethan exchanged a surprised glance with Victoria. She slowly whispered, "I have wondered about that notebook for 20 years. Ethan opened the first page with careful hands, never imagining that the ordinary-looking notebook before him would reveal a side of Samuel Carter that neither his own family nor the entire town had ever truly known. With careful hands, Ethan turned the first page of the notebook. The paper had yellowed with age, yet every line remained neat and easy to read. There were no dramatic confessions, no records of money earned, and no list of personal achievements. Instead, every page contained a date, a first name, and a brief description written in Samuel Carter's steady handwriting. Ethan read the first entry aloud. March 14th. Mrs. Henderson. Repaired furnace before the snowstorm. She insisted on paying later. Told her soup would be enough. Emma looked up at her father with surprise. He wrote about helping people? Ethan nodded slowly. Apparently, he remembered every person. Victoria leaned closer as Ethan continued reading. April 2nd. Young couple traveling west. Replaced fan belt. They had a baby sleeping in the back seat. They looked tired. Wish them safe roads. Another page followed. July 18th. Farmer with broken tractor during harvest. Fixed it before sunrise. He tried to leave money on the workbench after I walked away. Returned it to his mailbox. Ethan paused, turning another page with growing disbelief. The notebook continued the same way for years. Every entry described someone who had crossed Samuel's path, someone who had received kindness without ever becoming a headline or a story told at church gatherings. There were teachers, truck drivers, widows, college students, veterans, young parents, and strangers whose last name Samuel had never even learned. Beside many names, he had added simple notes. Pray for his family. She finally smiled today. Remember to check on him before winter. Victoria quietly wiped away a tear before speaking. He was keeping track, not because he wanted credit, but because he never wanted to forget people. Ethan slowly nodded. He remembered people better than he remembered himself. Emma smiled softly. Grandpa had a really big heart. Ethan looked at his daughter with gentle pride. Yes, sweetheart. Bigger than any of us realized. As he turned another page, something unexpected slipped onto his lap. It was a folded receipt from a grocery store dated nearly 18 years earlier. Ethan unfolded it carefully. Attached to it was a handwritten note. Paid for groceries after she quietly put back the milk because she could not afford it. Emma was only a baby then. Nobody should have to choose between food and dignity. Ethan stopped reading. His breathing became slower as realization settled over him. That was us. Victoria looked at him with surprise. Ethan smiled through moist eyes. After my wife passed away, money was almost gone. I remember wondering how the grocery bill became lower than expected. I thought the cashier had made a mistake. Emma looked at him in confusion. Grandpa paid. Ethan nodded, without telling me. Victoria gently closed her eyes for a brief moment. Even his own family did not always know when he was helping. Ethan continued turning the pages. Every few entries, Samuel had written one sentence across the bottom of the page, as though reminding himself why he chose this way of living. Respect arrives quietly. Grace grows where pride stays silent. Second chances begin with ordinary people. Victoria smiled faintly as she recognized the familiar wisdom that had shaped her own life. Ethan finally reached the last completed page. Unlike the others, it contained no list of names. Instead, there was only a single paragraph written in careful handwriting. If my son is reading this one day, I hope he understands that kindness is never measured by how many people remember your name. It is measured by how many people discover hope because you crossed their path. If he chooses the same road, then everything I ever tried to build will still be alive. Ethan gently closed the notebook and held it against his chest. For the first time since his father's passing, he realized that the greatest inheritance Samuel Carter had left behind could never be counted in dollars, because it had always been quietly multiplying inside the lives of other people. The porch had grown quieter as the afternoon slowly gave way to evening. Long shadows stretched across the yard while the distant hills glowed beneath the fading Montana sun. Ethan carefully placed the notebook back inside the cedar box, leaving only the sealed envelope resting in his hands. The paper had become slightly brittle with age, but the ink on the front remained clear and steady. For my son, when the time is right. He traced the familiar handwriting with his thumb before looking toward Victoria. You carried this for 20 years. She smiled gently. Some promises become easier with time. This one became heavier. Ethan nodded with understanding. He slowly opened the envelope, careful not to damage it. Inside was a single folded letter written on ordinary lined paper. He unfolded it with both hands and quietly began reading aloud. Dear Ethan, if these words have found you, then life has already taught you lessons I wished I could have spared you from. I hope you have learned that people are not measured by what they own, but by what they quietly choose to give away. If you have become the kind of man who works honestly, loves deeply, and keeps showing kindness after disappointment, then you already possess everything I ever hoped to leave you. Ethan paused, his voice catching for a moment before continuing. There will always be people who believe success belongs only to those with money, titles, or recognition. Do not argue with them. Simply keep living in a way that proves them wrong. Emma looked up at her father with wide eyes, listening as though her grandfather were speaking directly to all three of them. Ethan swallowed gently before reading the next lines. The young woman sitting beside, you made me one promise many years ago. I never wanted her money because kindness loses its meaning when it becomes a transaction. But I believe she would one day have the opportunity to help many more people than I ever could. That was worth far more than any check she offered me. Victoria quietly lowered her head, unable to hide the emotion filling her eyes. Ethan continued reading. If she has returned, then she kept her word. Thank her, not because she became successful, but because she remembered. Gratitude is one of the rarest forms of wealth. Silence settled over the porch except for the gentle rustling of leaves beyond the fence line. Ethan turned to the final section of the letter. As for you, my son, I have only one request. Do not spend your life trying to repay me. I never kept score. Instead, find someone whose burden feels too heavy for one pair of shoulders. Lighten it if you can. If your daughter grows up believing that dignity matters more than applause, then our family will remain richer than any fortune this world can offer. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. No one spoke for several moments. The words lingered in the evening air with a quiet strength that needed no explanation. Emma gently slipped her small hand into her father's again. I think Grandpa already knew you would do that. Ethan smiled through grateful tears. I hope so. Victoria reached into her satchel one final time and carefully placed a thin folder on the porch table. There is something else. Ethan looked at it curiously. What is it? Victoria answered with complete sincerity. For years, I believed the best way to honor your father was to build something in his name. I created plans for a national charitable foundation that would carry Samuel Carter's legacy across the country. Ethan looked down at the folder but did not open it. After everything he had just read, only one question mattered. He quietly met Victoria's eyes and asked, Did my father ever ask for his name to be remembered? Victoria slowly shook her head. No, not once. Ethan gently pushed the folder back toward her with a peaceful smile. Then I do not think he would want us to start now. Victoria looked at the folder for a long moment before slowly pulling it back in her lap. Instead of disappointment, a quiet smile appeared on her face. You answered exactly the way he would have, she said softly. Ethan looked toward the fading sunlight stretching across the open pasture. My father spent his whole life avoiding attention. I cannot honor him by doing the opposite. Victoria nodded with complete understanding. Then perhaps I've been trying to repay him the wrong way. Emma tilted her head. What is the right way? Victoria looked at the little girl before answering. By making sure the kindness never stops. The three of them sat quietly as evening settled. Over the old farmhouse, somewhere beyond the trees, cattle moved slowly across the neighboring ranch, and the distant sound of wind chimes drifted from a nearby porch. Ethan rested his hands on the cedar box. There's a family a few miles from here, he said after a thoughtful silence. The father lost his job last month. His truck needs repairs, and without it he cannot get to interviews. He has not asked anyone for help because he is too proud. Victoria smiled gently. Your father would already have the truck in his garage. Ethan laughed quietly. He probably would. Emma's eyes brightened. Can we help them? Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. Yes, sweetheart. I think we can. Victoria reached into her purse, but before taking out her checkbook, she stopped herself. She remembered Samuel's words as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Kindness was never meant to become a transaction. She slowly put the checkbook away and instead asked, What does the truck need? Ethan thought for a moment. A rebuild transmission, new brakes, and a few smaller repairs. I can do the labor myself if I have the parts. Victoria nodded. Then I will quietly cover the parts. No one needs to know where they came from. Ethan smiled. That sounds much more like my father. Emma clapped her hands together. Can I help too? Ethan reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. You already are. Victoria looked at the little girl with warmth. Would you like to write an encouraging note for the family? Sometimes words help people as much as repairs do. Emma smiled. I can do that. She hurried inside and returned a few minutes later carrying colored paper and a box of crayons. Sitting cross-legged on the porch floor, she carefully wrote a simple message in large letters. Keep believing. Better days are coming. She drew a bright yellow sunrise in one corner and a small blue heart in the other. Victoria quietly watched her, realizing that Samuel's greatest gift had never been hidden inside the cedar box. It had been quietly passed from one generation to the next without anyone noticing. Ethan closed the notebook and carefully returned the letter, the photograph, and the leather card holder to their places before lowering the cedar lid once more. The soft click of the brass latch sounded less like an ending than the beginning of something new. Victoria looked across the peaceful property and said, For 20 years, I believed I was searching for a family so I could repay a debt. Now I understand that I was really searching for someone who could remind me why I made that promise in the first place. Ethan nodded. Then let us keep the promise together. Victoria extended her hand, not as a billionaire making an offer, but as one ordinary person standing beside another. Ethan accepted it with a firm handshake. There were no cameras, no speeches, and no reporters waiting beyond the gravel driveway. Only three people on an old Montana porch quietly deciding that tomorrow morning, somewhere nearby, one struggling family would wake up to hope without ever knowing how many hearts had worked together to place it on their doorstep. The next morning arrived with a cool Montana breeze, carrying the scent of fresh pine across the fields as sunlight slowly filled the old farmhouse kitchen. Ethan stood at the stove making pancakes, while Emma carefully set 3 places at the worn wooden table. When Victoria stepped inside after an early walk across the property, she paused quietly at the doorway. Nothing about the breakfast was expensive. The coffee was simple, the plates did not match, and the furniture carried decades of scratches left behind by ordinary family life. Yet she realized she had not experienced this kind of peace in years. Ethan noticed her smile. Please sit down. Victoria thanked him and joined them at the table. Before anyone began eating, Ethan looked toward the empty chair that had belonged to Samuel for so many years. He did not say a word. He simply bowed his head for a brief moment. Emma did the same. Victoria followed without hesitation. It felt less like mourning and more like gratitude. After breakfast, the 3 of them carried the cedar box into the old garage. Ethan carefully placed it on the highest shelf beside his father's weathered toolbox, the same place where Samuel had once kept the most valuable things in his life. There was no lock, no glass display, and no sign explaining its importance. It belonged exactly where it had always belonged, among honest tools that existed only to help others. Victoria looked around the garage one final time. Every wrench, every oil stain, every faded calendar on the wall reminded her that greatness sometimes lived in places the world never thought to admire. Ethan closed the garage door, and together they drove a few miles to the home of the struggling family he had mentioned the night before. The old pickup truck already sat in the driveway waiting for repairs. Ethan quietly rolled up his sleeves and began working beneath the hood while Victoria unloaded the replacement parts she had purchased without placing her name on a single receipt. Emma slipped the handwritten note into the family's mailbox before returning with a bright smile. No photographs were taken. No speeches were given. The grateful family believed a kind neighbor had simply decided to help. As the afternoon passed, the truck finally started with a smooth, steady engine. Ethan wiped his hands on a clean shop towel and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Victoria watched him from a distance and suddenly understood why Samuel had refused her money all those years ago. The greatest reward had never been receiving thanks. It had always been watching hope return to someone else's face. Before leaving Montana that evening, Victoria stood beside her car and looked once more toward the farmhouse resting beneath the wide western sky. "I came here believing I owed your father a debt," she said softly. "Now I know he never expected repayment. He only wanted the kindness to keep moving." Ethan nodded with peaceful certainty. Then it never stopped. Emma stepped forward and hugged Victoria tightly. "You can come back anytime. Victoria smiled warmly. I think I will." As the black car disappeared down the quiet country road, Ethan remained standing beside his daughter until the dust slowly settled. The farmhouse looked exactly as it had the day before, yet everything had changed. Samuel Carter had left behind no fortune, no famous name, and no monument carved from stone. Instead, he had left a way of living that asked for nothing except quiet dignity, steady grace, and the courage to offer second chances without expecting recognition. Years from now, the cedar box would still rest on its shelf, the notebook would still remind one family what truly mattered, and somewhere another stranger would receive unexpected kindness without ever knowing where the story had begun. In the end, the richest inheritance Samuel Carter ever gave his son was not something that could be held in his hands. It was something that quietly continued beating inside his heart.